Hello to all the listeners out there. Welcome to our Hoard's Dairyman Monthly webinar. My name is Abby Bauer, and I will serve as the host for today's program, which will focus on low-forage diets. Feeding high-quality forages is the cornerstone of efficient dairy production, but increasing incidences of droughts, floods, and other extreme weather conditions can make high-quality forages scarce and expensive. In response to these challenges, we will discuss strategies to make the best of a bad situation and to talk about how we can get the most from your herd when forage quality is lacking. If you're listening to the presentation live, you can get a copy of the slides. Just go to that GoToWebinar control panel and click on the handouts link, and there you'll find a link to a PDF copy of the presentation. You can also ask our presenter questions following the presentation. Just type those into the questions section of the control panel and we will address them a little bit later. Today, we welcome our speaker, Dr. Kirby Krogstad, to the webinar. Kirby was born and raised on dairy farms in Minnesota and South Dakota. He graduated from South Dakota State University, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Michigan State University with degrees in dairy and animal sciences. Currently, he is an assistant professor at The Ohio State University in the Department of Animal Science. His research focuses on how nutrition and ration formulation can enhance animal health, productivity, and sustainability, with a particular emphasis on improving rumen health and managing systemic inflammation. Dr. Krogstad, welcome to the webinar, and I look forward to hearing your presentation titled Managing Through Droughts and Floods by Optimizing Low Forage Rations.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and we're ready to get started then, and you can hear me and see everything you need to see?
Yes, we can.
All right, excellent. Well, we will just get to it then. So like Abby was saying, I think in the upper Midwest, Great Lakes region especially, we think about these low forage diets as scenarios that are not optimum. And we often think about increasing things like a really good quality corn silage, or really good quality haylage or grass hay as ways to improve our dairy operation. But I think we all have to acknowledge, and we all realize this to some extent, that there will always be cases where we just can't feed the forage that we want to feed, whether it be drought, flood, mycotoxin issues, or just forage quality issues. There will always be things that make it less than ideal. And so that kind of led to some of the work that we started out with during my time here at Ohio State, was trying to make the best of those rough situations. So we'll kind of jump in with that agenda. We'll talk about the challenges and some of the context surrounding low forage diets, and we'll talk about what I'm doing, or how I would define those. What types of fiber am I looking at, and what's kind of the cutoffs or the ranges that I think define these low forage rations. We'll go through some of the data that's been published over the years, and then we'll go through some data that's really fresh off the presses here from Ohio State. We're going to present it this year at Tri-State at ADSA, so you'll have to be on the lookout for it then. So, and I think one other point to start with before I kind of jump into some of these definitional things is I geared some of this presentation towards thinking for folks from that upper Midwest and Great Lakes region, where we are typically feeding higher forage diets. I think we can learn a lot from our colleagues out west and in the southwest part of the country, who are often feeding diets that are 10, 12, 15% forage NDF and having a lot of success with that. So before I start, I would say there's a lot of people that have a lot of boots on the ground experience that I think could lend a lot of expertise in this type of scenario. So when we talk about the best measure of fiber or forage fiber, there's 4 of them that jump to mind for me. Is you can look at the percent forage in the diet, just comparing forages to concentrates. But what's the problem with that? Well, the easy one is corn silage is about half actual roughage and about half corn grain. So percent forage is not a great way to look at how much forage is in the diet or how much forage fiber is in the diet. You can look at total NDF, but as I just kind of referenced, we can have forage NDF or non-forage NDF. So that total NDF number is not really an ideal one in my eyes either, to think about how much effective fiber is in the rumen. You can have PENDF, or physically effective fiber, and that's a nice measure, but you have to go out and do a Penn State particle separator. And even then, sometimes getting an accurate whole diet sample to get a good PENDF number is difficult. And those numbers have shifted over time. Our ideal diet, we used to think 10% on the 19 millimeter sieve, but that's gone down to less than 5 and even less than 2%, depending on the diet and the scenario. But the number I'm going to focus on, or that I like to think about, is forage fiber and forage NDF. And I think it's just a really quick, easy number that you can get on paper from your chemical analyses that you're sending out from your rations. And I think it offers a good bit of information for relatively low input. So you're going to hear me talking about these low fiber or low forage diets, and I'm going to often reference the forage fiber in that diet. So that's kind of setting the playing field for today. The other reason I like to use forage NDF as a number is NASEM 2021 and a lot of past research and experts kind of have a set of recommendations built around forage NDF. And so the most recent NASEM would suggest that an optimum forage NDF is going to range from 17 to 27%. And what I really like about the figure from that chapter is they give you a whole host of factors that can shift that one way or the other. And it kind of acknowledges that there is no concrete number that's ideal or perfect or best at any one time, but we think we have this range where we know cows function well. But when you start digging into some of the data more recently and in more higher producing herds, and as I've spent a little bit more time with some nutritionists and dairy producers making a great deal of milk, I've started to kind of wonder if we have that range entirely figured out. But for example, if you have really high intake cows, you probably need a little less forage NDF because otherwise you're going to limit their milk producing capability. Or if you have really finely chopped forages, or if you have a really high starch degradability, if you're feeding something like high moisture corn or an intensely processed barley, or maybe wheat or something, then that forage NDF number may shift. But as we see, or as I think it's important to acknowledge, those things will all affect the required amount of forage NDF in the ration. In that same table, they have some recommendations about the minimum forage NDF required based on something like diet starch or total diet starch. And I know that's not an ideal number because it's not so much about the whole starch in the diet, it's about how much of that is degraded in the rumen and how quickly it's degraded. But you can see some of their recommendations here. So they would say if you have a 30% starch diet, your minimum forage NDF is going to be about 19. But when you read that chapter in total, there's a sentence in there that I think is really important, and it's that data are needed to determine how water-soluble carbohydrates and neutral detergent-soluble fibers affect this NDF requirement. That's the quote. And I think I would expand that to just say that data are needed in general to determine how carbohydrate profile affects that NDF or forage NDF requirement. And that's some of what we're going to get into today. So there are some recommendations out there. There are some estimates, but I think we're still missing some critical pieces that will help us formulate rations when we're having to feed less forage than we might want. So when we think about these scenarios for someone around the Great Lakes and Upper Midwest, where we're trying to feed as much forage as we can or as much high quality forage as we can, one of the reasons is drought. And I use this as an example because we actually had quite a situation here in Ohio and in certain parts of the country, but I pulled up the drought monitor map from late January. And you can see, and I'm just going to pull up Ohio as an example and highlight that for you since that's where I'm stationed nowadays. You know, right now our soil moisture is looking fairly good. But when we go back to this last September, Ohio and West Virginia were really hurting. We were hurting for rain. We had forage availability issues, and we were going to have some of those kind of tailing through to this year as we restock some of those forage supplies. But my point being is those drought maps flash up in a hurry with a lot of red. And then when that happens, we can run short of forage. So that's an instance where we need to be prepared to deal with those issues because it's going to happen more often. And it's going to be more severe when it does happen. The other example would be floods. There was quite a severe flood while I was in Nebraska for my master's degree program where forages and cattle were literally swept away. And so we've got to be prepared for those types of scenarios. I think another one is feed costs. You know, high quality forages are always going to be expensive. And then finally, if you just happen to have forages, like I mentioned, that are poor quality and poor hygiene, we need to understand how to optimize these bad or worse scenarios. So with that foundation built, there's a few considerations that I'm going to kind of step through with some of the past data before we get into some of the things we're working on here at Ohio State. And the first one is digestibility. So you've got to consider that the amount of feed that animals going to digest in the rumen, because of all these dietary factors at play, will change. If you're someone that really watches feed efficiency and you all of a sudden have to go to a low forage ration, that number and your benchmarks should probably shift. Milk fat production and milk fat percent is another one where if you're in a scenario where you're used to feeding 17 or even probably more like 18 to 20, 24% forage NDF, if those are the numbers you're used to, and you have to go to something that's less than 16 or 15, that milk fat percent and milk fat production number is one that you're going to have to kind of re-benchmark in your mind. The other one is rumen acidosis. You will see reduced rumen pH, and we'll go through some of that data when you're feeding these lower forage rations. But then the question that I got really interested in during the end of my PhD program, and that I'm kind of carrying through to now, is does that acidosis event lead to some kind of inflammatory or health challenge that we need to be conscious of? And do we need to be especially conscious of that when we're feeding a reduced forage ration? So those are the considerations I bring up, or that I think about when I'm going to put a diet together. So what are the effects of forage when we put them through a cow? I think I really try to conceptualize things with mind maps and images like this. And so when we think about feeding a cow and ultimately having the feed they eat and the digestibility and the milk yield as the outputs, how do the forages actually affect that? Well, to really understand it, we have to go back upstream. There's a couple of things that happen with that diet because of the ingredients we include, and two of them are rate of passage and rate of digestion. Those two things are going to affect both feed intake and feed digestibility. But how does forage affect those? So generally, and I want to highlight that, these are generalities. So don't go saying this is true all the time, but I think putting things in a frame of reference using generalities like this can be really useful. So if we reduce forage NDF, that's this green arrow, we generally, if we're going to reduce forage NDF, we will generally see an increase in the rate of passage. Now, the rate of digestion, I put a question mark there, and that's one where it depends on the forage. It depends how much of it, how much it's processed. So that's kind of a question mark. It really depends on that whole scenario. But if we decrease forage NDF, we would tend to see a reduction in the rate of passage. So I'm sorry, my arrows here are actually backwards. But those two dynamics will then feed into digestibility. But again, the problem being we don't always know what's going to happen to rate of digestion, but all those factors are going to come to a point and influence digestibility and feed intake. And so generally, if passage rate is faster, then feed intake will go up. If passage rate is slower, feed intake will go down. But the rate of digestion is also part of that, so that feed intake one is also a question mark. It depends on a lot of the context surrounding the diet that you've put together in this scenario. So that's some of the challenges we have when we're thinking about how much forage to include. So we'll start with digestibility. We're going to start at the end of that equation and kind of look at 6 examples. So this might be overwhelming to look at first, and I want to remind everybody this is not like an extensive breakdown of all of the data we have published with different forage concentrations. It was kind of a grab bag of 6 or 7 example studies that I pulled out of the literature that I thought were kind of interesting. So what you'll see on these slides, and we're going to go through a series of these that are going to outline some data. We'll have the study and then the number that's graphed. So in this case, this is the NDF digestibility. This is from a paper I published with Dr. Kononov in 2021. The low forage diet, or LF, had a 46% fiber digestibility, and the high forage diet had a 45%. So that just kind of, that's how these graphs will look. When you come across the bottom, this is the diet. So this is some of the highlights from that diet. So in my case, we fed an 18 forage NDF or a 22 forage NDF diet, and those were composed of corn silage, alfalfa hay, and wheat straw. So those are, that's how this is all set up. So I'm going to start walking through these graphs. But what you'll see is we generally, when we reduce forage and we increase passage rate, we think, oh shoot, we're going to lose digestibility. But what is interesting when you dig into all of this data, that's not always the case. And it really depends on some of the, it depends on the surrounding carbohydrates. But as you can see in the study from 2021, we had a moderate change in forage fiber, and we actually maintained fiber digestibility in those diets. But I think what's important to understand is we maintained the concentrations of starch across those diets as well. But you can see examples where when we increase forage, we reduce our fiber digestibility fairly substantially. And that's often because we're including things like alfalfa hay or something that doesn't get as completely digested. And we also may be altering the dietary starch. So that's kind of the foundation to consider here, is that starch is part of it. When we reduce forage in these 2 examples, you can see the low forage diets had way, way lower fiber digestibility. But in those 2 examples, they also increased starch when they reduced forage. And we know that increasing starch ultimately reduces fiber digestibility. So that's why this is such a complex picture. And they also included alfalfa silage as their fiber source, just as some additional context for everybody. But so again, all these factors have to come together for us to really determine what's going on with that cow in these low forage rations. One of the things that is fairly consistent, regardless of how you're increasing forage fiber, is we do tend to see a slight increase in feed efficiency when we feed a higher forage diet. And that gets back to that passage rate and digestibility piece that I mentioned earlier. But again, that's not always the case. So we can see there's 3 instances, this study from 2020 from Dr. Elias Uden, Lee et al. 2020, and Yang 2007, where as we increase forage fiber, we get a fairly substantial increase in feed efficiency. But in those cases, or in most cases, that doesn't necessarily come from an increase in milk yield. It comes from a reduction in feed intake and a maintaining of milk yield to create that increased feed efficiency. So if you're in a scenario where you have to reduce your forage fiber, then you probably need to recalibrate your expectations for a pen level feed efficiency, where if maybe for your high cows, you expect to be at 1.7, but you have to feed a really low forage diet because of forage quality issues or drought or what have you, then you probably need to moderate your expectation for the feed efficiency of that group. It's probably going to come down a tenth or two, depending on where they started to begin with. But you can see here in a few examples where we lose about a tenth of a point of feed efficiency, depending on that scenario. But like I said, there are some instances where we're able to maintain it, but it really is dependent on that whole diet picture. So we have digestibility alterations, we have some feed efficiency alterations. What about milk fat? Again, this is one that's fairly consistent. It's neutral to positive. As we increase forage fiber, we're generally going to see greater milk fat concentration. So you can see here in my study from 2021, it's about 0.2 of a point. Again, about 0.2 of a point going from 19 forage NDF to a 25 forage NDF. And that's fairly consistent across most of these studies. But then there's a couple examples here in the middle. You can see where that milk fat concentration was relatively stable. So again, it's not a guarantee, but usually when you're going to increase forage fiber, you'll increase milk fat. And so I think this is an important one too, as we talk about how the Holstein breed is shifted and we're getting so much more milk fat out of these cows, herds making 4, 4.5, even up to 4.8, 4.9% milk fat on Holsteins. If you go to a scenario where you have to reduce the forage fiber in the diet, then you need to understand that you're probably going to lose a tenth or two or more on your milk fat concentration. And that's the important part. This is just the milk fat concentration, not milk fat yield. Because when we look at actual fat yield across different forage fiber inclusions, the picture is not the same. We generally, if you do this well, you're going to maintain your milk fat yield in a fair amount of cases. And actually, I'll highlight these 2 studies in the middle. They went from a low forage scenario, from a 19 forage NDF to 24, or from 17 to 21, and they lost milk fat yield. And that's because they maintained the milk fat concentration, but when they reduced forage, they got much, much more milk yield in those cows, which led to greater milk fat yield. So just because you lose milk fat concentration does not mean you're going to lose milk fat yield when you're balancing these reduced forage rations. But again, those 2 examples in the middle, we're going from a 24 to a 19 forage NDF or a 21 to a 17. Those are not dramatically low forage NDFs. For some in the upper Midwest, Great Lakes, that might sound lower. So for some in New England, that might sound lower. But if you go west to the west and southwest, you'll often see diets that are under 16, under 15, and even down to 10 or 12 forage NDF. But they're still managing to create a lot of milk solids in those scenarios. We'll talk more about how to do that in these scenarios. But again, milk fat concentration when you reduce forage, yes, you'll likely lose a couple tenths. Milk fat yield, you do not necessarily have to lose if you're reducing the forage of your diet. You just have to balance that ration effectively. Okay, so that kind of laid the foundation for some of that performance data. We'll jump into this acidosis picture. The first thing to start with and understand is that there's thresholds and definitions that I'm going to use to define rumen acidosis. As an academic, we always like definitions and clean cutoffs. And there's 2 of them that are fairly common. But the 2 that I'll highlight here is acidosis or subacute ruminal acidosis, or SARA, is usually defined as cows that have a rumen pH below 5.6 for 3 hours per day, or have a pH below 5.8 to 6 for 5 hours a day. So those are the times when we'll start to refer to cows as having SARA, or if you're reading literature about prevalence of SARA, incidence of SARA, relationships of SARA to different performance factors, make sure to read that definition to get an idea of what's actually going on there. But the thing I want to understand with low forage diets is you will see a reduced rumen pH. So this is my study from Nebraska in 2000 and published in 2021. And when we went from a 22 forage NDF, which is going to be this dotted line, these two dotted lines, to an 18 forage NDF, you lose about 1/10 to 2/10, or you have a reduced rumen pH by about 1 to 2/10, and that holds throughout most of the day. But in our case, that the shape of that curve didn't shift, and it wasn't a dramatic change from the low to high forage. So if you do this well, you will see a reduction in pH, but it won't be dramatic to the point that I would consider it a big concern. But so again, you will see a reduced pH throughout the day, and that's not just our study, that's across a handful of projects. Out of the 6 or 7 that I pulled, these 5 had rumen pH data, and 4 of those 5 had a reduction in rumen pH when you reduce forage. But you can see actually the one that I showed you from my project is the only one where we were dipping into that region of concern of subacute ruminal acidosis, where we had cows getting down under 5.8 for a substantial amount of time. Otherwise, these studies from 2020 and 2021, we were not in that range that we would start to consider concerning for ruminal acidosis. So again, if you're shifting from a high forage to a low forage approach, you will get a lower pH, but whether that's penalizing is kind of up for debate and depends on how you put that ration together. So I threw out the inflammation bit earlier, and we'll start to dive into that here. But why do we care about reduced rumen pH and SARA? I think we need to remember some of the fundamentals here, which is subacute ruminal acidosis does lead to substantial reductions in NDF digestibility. And you can see that here in this graph on the right, where our control group in this study had a typical diet and what we consider a normal rumen pH of around 6. And they put a bag of, they did an in situ digestibility study, and they put a bag of hay in the rumen. Half of that fiber was digested. They put that same bag of hay or that same type of hay into a cow with acidosis, and we had this substantial reduction down to 37% fiber digestibility. So when we have these depressed rumen pH conditions, we are at risk of losing some of our fiber digestibility, which is an important niche of these cattle. The other part about pH and SARA is it's a risk factor for milk fat depression. There are instances where you can add a little bit of fat to a diet and not have a milk fat issue, but then if you add fat and you have a low rumen pH, we can run into those biohydrogenation issues and have milk fat depression. So that's one of the other big reasons to pay attention to this. We also have the altered microbiome and altered VFA profile that I'm not going to get into, but we get to these last two here. Change in LPS and biogenic amines. These are just compounds in the rumen that are kind of associated with the microbes that are present. But as we have a reduction in pH, those compounds go up. And the reason that is a concern is those compounds, when they come into contact with tissues, can cause an inflammatory response and change or damage that tissue structure. So that leads to this question is rumen acidosis and SARA associated with inflammation? Now there is some data that's been summarized that started to lead people to think that yes, it might be associated with inflammation. So in this graph on the left, you'll see rumen LPS in the top panel, plasma haptoglobin in the middle, and serum amyloid A on the bottom. And as you go from left to right, that is an increase in the grain allocation to those cows. And these authors ended up concluding that when you increase dietary concentrate level, which was poorly defined, it's not very specific, but when you increase to above 45%, they started to see this increase in plasma haptoglobin, which is an inflammatory biomarker, and this increase in plasma serum amyloid A, which is another biomarker for inflammation. So that led some to think that if we increase concentrates too much, that's a risk factor for inflammation. But the important thing to remember is this data set came from what I call challenge experiments, where they were purposefully challenging those cows with a lot of grain and a lot of very fermentable grain in an unstable feeding environment. And so this may not be the best representation of whether on-farm acidosis incidence is related to systemic inflammation. But one of the things that we did at Michigan State to try to help understand this question a little bit more was we ran our own subacute ruminal acidosis challenge experiment. And we had 2 diets. We had a kind of a standard diet, was what we would call it, 24 forage NDF, 26% starch, and the starch source was corn. And then we fed a diet that was 16% forage NDF and 32% starch with corn, barley, and wheat. And we took rumen samples, or rumen papillae samples, to try to understand how the structure of the rumen changed during that challenge. So on the left, this is kind of a normal papillae, what we'd expect it to look like. This most outer layer has a really vigorous and a great amount of integrity to the structure. It's highly organized. There's no breaking down of that tissue. But what we saw when we fed the higher starch acidosis inducing diet, we saw this thinning of the corneal layer and an expansion of that innermost interstitial layer. And that led us to think that maybe there is something to this, where that rumen tissue is changing and adapting to those higher starch environments. So there's a lot of things to consider here, but that led to the work we're doing here at Ohio State and thinking about how can we optimize low forage diets when we have greater risk for rumen acidosis and reduced rumen pH. We have greater risk for milk fat depression. How do we optimize those scenarios? So as we finish up this presentation with some of the data from Ohio State, we're going to focus on starch in a low forage ration. And the reason I think about that is because starch is a great source of digestible energy for cows. But the thing about it, with any nutrient, and I show this slide all the time, is that it's about finding that optimal concentration. But that optimal concentration is not going to be the same at every farmer and every diet. So we've got to determine that optimal in a host of different scenarios. So in this case, in a low forage diet, where is that sweet spot for starch concentration and starch inclusion? Because if we're to the left of that star, we're probably missing out on milk protein production and milk production. But if we're feeding too much and we're going to the right of that, we'll have milk fat depression, we'll have subacute ruminal acidosis, and we'll potentially have an inflammatory response. So what is that number? I think through years and years of field practice, we've understood that low forage diets require less starch. But how much less, and a really hard number I was having a hard time finding as I dug through the data. So that's the experiment we wanted to run. When we look at some of the data in high forage traditional rations, you can see that increasing starch in many cases will increase milk protein yield. So here we increase starch from 25% in this red graph to 30% for the black graph, had an 80 gram per day increase in milk protein. Here from Bowerman in 2015, they went from a 16% low starch diet to a 32% high starch diet and increased milk protein by 100 grams. And in our study, we actually saw an increase in milk protein as we increased starch as well. So increasing starch is a tool to generate more revenue for these dairy farms, 40 to 60 cents per head per day, given the market prices at the time in these studies. So that's why we need to optimize starch inclusion in these low forage rations. The other reason that I think starch inclusion is such an important part of this question is right now, and at least in Ohio, for the past 6 months probably, corn has been really, really cheap compared to other feeds on a nutrient basis. So my master's student, Andy Majewski, is writing our Buckeye Dairy Dollars article for our Buckeye Dairy News that comes out 6 times a year. And what you can see here is our corn-based ingredients on the far left. They're almost all green, which means they are a bargain buy at this time, or that they're at least priced in below what we'd expect given the nutrients they deliver. So corn's cheap, so we need to figure out how to optimize it in a low forage diet scenario. So the experiment we set up was it was a small one, and it was meant to be a bit of a pilot experiment. What you'll see is we had a low starch ration, a mid starch ration, and a high starch ration, and these are the nutrient specs from those diets. We had a 37% NDF down to 28. We held our forage NDF at about 12.5. So if we go back to the very beginning, NASEM says that the optimal forage NDF in a ration is somewhere between 17 and 27% of the diet. So we're well below that. We're at 12.5%. We increased starch we targeted 20 and up to 30%, but our corn silage had more starch than we expected. So it's actually 23 up to 33%. So our high starch diet was a pretty hot diet in this low forage environment. Crude protein was about 16, and then fatty acids were about 4.5. They went up a little bit as we increased starch, and that's just a factor of the increasing corn grain inclusion, which is going to bring in some of those fatty acids from the corn. So how did we achieve that? These rations were corn silage and haylage-based rations. We did include 3.8% of the diet dry matter as cottonseed. I think cottonseed is one of those really good feedstuffs. So if you have forage inventory issues and you can reasonably get cottonseed to your farm, get at a reasonable price, it's a great purchase for these types of scenarios. So that's how we manipulated these diets. Then we had the low, mid, and the high grain mix. And the only difference within those grain mixes is that we were trading out corn grain for soy hulls. So that's what drove this difference in starch as we went from low to high. I think any good nutritionist will be like, well, what was the particle size of these diets? What did they look like in the bunk? And that's a great question. So you can see here, the red is the low starch, the gray is the mid starch, and the black is the high starch. So we had about 9.5 to 10% in that top tier, which is actually higher than recent recommendations from Dr. Grant at the Minor Institute, where they recommend then 2 to 5% of that top layer. But again, this is a really low forage diet. So these recommendations may not fit in this scenario. Our 8mm screen was about 35%, the 4mm about 10, and the remainder fell to the pan. So that gives you an idea of the breakdown. When you pull that diet out, this is what it looks like. We had fair bit of stemmy haylage and hay on that top screen. A lot of the cottonseed and corn silage was on the middle screen, and you can see the grain comprising most of what was left in the pan. So that'll just give you an idea of what that diet looked like and felt like in the bunk. So we'll start with the room and pH data. Generally, when we're feeding a normal forage diet of 17 to 27% forage NDF, and we feed additional starch, we will normally see a reduction in room and pH. We would expect that. But in this case, with a low forage NDF diet, the additional starch did not seem to change room and pH throughout the day. Actually, all three of these treatments laid almost directly on top of each other. But did these cows have sera? Well, yes. Each of these cows in this low forage scenario of a 12.7% forage NDF diet, all of them would meet the definition of sera. They were below a pH of 5.8 for approximately 10 hours per day. So we did have sera incidence in these cows. But was that related? Well, and to be a little more complete on that picture, I like to use fecal pH as another marker of gut fermentation and the status of the carbohydrate fermentation in that diet. And we did not see any shift in fecal pH as a result of diet starch in this study. But now, was that related to inflammation? So I'd mentioned one of the markers we use to measure inflammation is plasma haptoglobin. That's an acute phase protein secreted by the liver, and when it goes up, we generally consider a cow to be having some kind of inflammatory response. But what we can see in this study is as we increased starch, we did not see any acute phase response in this really low forage diet. So we did not have a change in room and pH. We did have subacute ruminal acidosis, but we did not have, based on haptoglobin and one other acute phase protein called LBP, we did not have an inflammatory response occurring in these cows. But what did happen when the rubber meets the road? What actually happened to these cows at the bulk tank? Well, the first and foremost, the thing to remember, as I mentioned at the beginning, is feed efficiency is going to look different, and that's because on these low forage diets, cows eat a lot. This was a group of cows eating about 75 pounds a day. I put it up here as kilos per day to give everybody a little bit of a math problem to try to solve. But we were eating, our low starch cows ate 35 kilos, the high starch were eating 37 kilos, and that increased, which I'm not really sure how to explain. But the point is these cows ate a ton of feed. But what happened to milk yield? Milk yield didn't actually change. Fluid milk was fairly stable across those three groups. But just as you would expect, as we increased starch in the ration in these low forage diets, we went from a 3.93 milk fat down to a 3.34 as we increased starch. That led to a dramatic change in energy corrected milk, going from 53 kilos a day in that low starch diet down to 49 kilos per day in the high starch diet. So that is an enormous change. And when you put it on a pounds level, it's going to be 6, 7, 8 pounds a day difference for some of these cows. So although we had we increase starch, we lose milk fat. We expect that. That's kind of a by the book response. And that response was super economically relevant in this scenario. So it's an important thing to consider when we're reducing forage in a diet. We've got to think about the total starch load. The starch we fed was dry ground corn. So that 20% number in this case seemed to be the best. But if you were feeding barley, wheat, oats or something, or high moisture corn, that number might change. So these are all things that I think need further investigation in a low forage ration. So why did that happen? Well, we actually had a very classic milk fatty acid response. This purple line is trans 10 cis 12. This group on the far left is our low starch. This one in the middle is our mid starch. This one on the right is our high starch. And you can see as we go from a low starch to a high starch ration, we dramatically increase trans 10 cis 12 fatty acid. Why do we care about that fatty acid? Because that fatty acid is the driver of milk fat depression in cows. So when we increase starch in these low forage diets, we get a dramatic increase in the types of fatty acids that reduce milk fat in the mammary gland. So that was just the biology and the clarity of this picture came through quite nicely. So again, finding that optimum. In this case, we fed from 20% up to 33%, and we determined that that 20% number in a low forage diet was much more effective at maximizing milk production than 25 or 30 or 33% of the diet starch. So when we're thinking about starch and finding that optimum, I think it's important to understand how that curve shifts. So at the beginning, we talked about this curve trying to find that optimum. Well, if we're feeding a low forage diet, we're probably shifting that curve to the left. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. Where we might normally feed 25, 28, 30% starch, when we reduce forage in that diet, we shift this curve to the left. That optimal is more like 20 or 22% perhaps, or even lower because we didn't go below 20. So that's also a possibility. But if you're doing things like managing your bunk really well, providing a heavily buffered diet, which in this case, we did actually buffer the diet quite heavily with sodium bicarb. But if you shift it right, you can also do that with yeast. So there's a few things we can do to manage that rumen when we're providing starch in these diets to try to shift that curve to the right and drive milk yield. So keep those things in mind. So the take-home messages I have for you: reducing forage will reduce rumen pH. That's going to happen. Just be comfortable with that. Reducing forage will probably reduce your milk fat percent, but your yields, depending on how you put that diet together, can hold stable or even increase depending on how dramatic the change is. In our instance, where we fed 12.5% forage NDF, minimizing starch is a good consideration. About 20% in our case with a dry ground corn diet based on corn silage, alfalfa hay. Then finally, really pay attention to the forage source, grain particle size, and grain source in these diets, because all of those will feed into the calculus about how you're going to put that ration together. The questions that remain for me, and I think this is important to lay out, because again, I said there's a lot of nutritionists who've been boots on the ground for a long time, and they've worked this out through trial and error on their own. But I think we need to put really good biology to these numbers, really good data to these numbers. But we need to understand ideal starch source and processing in these types of diets, how much sugar in these diets might be beneficial, and then look at forage source. How will the fragility of that forage, the digestibility of that forage, how will those things affect how much forage to include or which forage might be most ideal when we have these low forage rations? I want to thank the team that made all this happen. So these are my students, Irie, Tita, and Andy. They're an excellent group. Again, they'll be presenting at Tri-State and ADSA on a host of topics. I hope you'll make sure to come visit them. I also want to thank the USDA and Ohio Dairy Producers as the sponsors for some of the research that I outlined in this presentation, and also my mentors, Dr. Bradford, Dr. Konoff, and Dr. Mamadova. Again, kind of a promotional plug. We have a few newsletters I'd really like it if everybody took the time to subscribe to. We have our Buckeye Dairy News that I mentioned throughout the webinar that you can find at dairy.osu.edu. Comes out 6 times a year and contains things covering all facets of dairy and agriculture from our extension team. I also do a newsletter myself called The Cow Professor and Some Other Thoughts, where I talk about a range of issues facing the dairy industry, and you can do that at Substack or on LinkedIn, but this QR code should take you to a place where you can sign up for that newsletter. So that is all that I have, and I'd welcome any questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Krogstad, for that presentation and for sharing your insight on low forage rations for dairy cattle. I think it's an area that I can tell that you're very excited about, so I'm glad you were able to share your knowledge and some of the research that you're doing with our audience today. To view this webinar again, it will be available on our archive later this week. You can also find all of our previous webinars from over the last more than a decade, and they're all available on the Hordes Dairyman website. Just go to hordes.com and check out the webinars tab. I hope that you'll make plans to attend some of our future webinars coming up in the next few months. Our April presentation will feature Jimena Laporta from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she'll be talking about heat stress impacts beyond summer and some of the implications that heat stress and other environmental stressors can have on dairy cattle throughout their entire lifespan. So that will be an interesting presentation and very timely considering the ramp up to summer heat. And then in May, we'll have a webinar favorite, our friend Mike Hutchins, who will be on the program, and he'll be talking about feeding dairy cattle for high milk components. So if those topics interest you, we hope you'll make plans to attend. Again, if you have any questions for Kirby, please type those into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will go through those at this time. I'll have you advance one slide, Dr. Krogstad, and then we will jump into the questions here. The first one talks specifically about the research you were featuring, and it was about slide 27, and you said that those cows a lot of the cows had Sarah, and this person was wondering if they were sorting the diet, or if you noticed excessive sorting of that ration.
That's an excellent question. So there's a couple details of the diet I didn't share, and one of them is that it was a really dry ration. It was a 74% dry matter because of the amount of soy hulls and non-forage fiber in the diet. So that viewer hit it on the button. These cows were sorting fairly aggressively, and that's one of the things that we probably need to address in, well, any ration really, but a low forage one especially, where you're feeding a lot of dry concentrate ingredients, is how do you reduce the ability of those animals to sort? So yes, it was heavily sorted. We don't have the sorting index and some of those numbers yet. That's still on my grad student's desk, but they definitely did just eyeball tests. They were picking through the forages, looking for the grains in those diets.
Great, thank you. Early in the presentation, you talked about how the increased starch content reduced fiber digestibility. In the rumen, is that due to how it impacts the bacteria or the total tract digestibility due to passage rate?
Yeah, so another great question, and one that we don't have totally drilled down. So I think there's a few possibilities. One is you can think it might be a pH effect, where if we add starch, we reduce rumen pH, and we reduce those bugs' abilities to act on fiber and to digest fiber. There's some data to suggest that those bugs that digest fiber do better and are more vibrant at a pH greater than 6. And as you dip below that, those bacteria slow and die, and their population shrinks. So that's one of the answers. The other one might be just kind of a competition where starch is quickly degraded, easy to eat compared to fiber, and so the bacteria might just shift and migrate to eating the most easy substrate. But we don't have that totally nailed down, but it's one that I think many people much smarter than me have been trying to address for years, and we're making progress, but we're not all the way there.
Going back to that Ohio State study with the sorting, how many cows were in that research?
Yeah, so I forgot to mention that it was a small pilot study. So we had 6 cows in a Latin square design. So those 6 cows went through each treatment. So it ends up being 18 cow observations.
Okay. Is beet pulp a suitable ingredient for a low forage diet?
I think there's a couple reasons. Well, first of all, I'd ask, are you talking about wet or dry beet pulp? Is it pelleted or bagged or whatever? So coming from Michigan, if you can get cheap wet beet pulp, I think that's a great ingredient because of the moisture that it brings to the diet. It can bind up some of those fines and maybe help reduce sorting. And it's relatively palatable, right? Cattle like beet pulp. And so it's a nice ingredient. So I think it's a good fermentable carbohydrate. It's not starch, so you're not loading up the ration with more starch. So yeah, if you can get it at an affordable cost, I think it's a great ingredient, especially the wet source, because of those physical characteristics.
Very good. This listener is saying, I like the mention of sugars. How does using molasses compared to lower cost lactose from whey? How does that work in a lower forage diet?
Another great question, and I wish I could tell you, or I wish you could tell me who that was. I would have. I would say for a listener, if you're interested in what sugar does in a ration, I've been trying to procure some funding to do that research question. So go ask all of your sugar selling friends and have them come to me, because that's a research question I want to address.
Sure, and I can connect you to the question asker later if you if you would like. And so, someone else was asking about sugar, if you could expand on that topic a little more. So it's apparently a popular area. Yeah.
Well, I think just as a generality, using sugar, we think we get a little more milk fat, a little more butyrate production, and it oftentimes, even though it's really quickly digested, if you're feeding that in place of starch, you can sometimes increase rumen pH. You can provide a little more stable rumen environment that's not as severe as when you're feeding a lot of starch. So I'd say it fits, it makes a lot of sense. The data that I'm familiar with would say that we're looking for total sugars in the ration to be somewhere between 6 and 7%. But then I think in a low forage scenario, I throw a lot of those recommendations out the window when we get below 17% forage NDF. So I think it'd be reasonable to expect that a higher sugar diet might make more sense when you're trying to optimize milk fat in a really tough scenario. But I have no data to back that up. That would just be like my gut instinct.
Do you have any thoughts on if low forage diets work better in specific breeds of cattle over other ones? And what about age of the cows, like first lactation cows versus more mature cows?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think like if we go to the sorting consideration, I'd be worried more about Jerseys than Holsteins. I was a Jersey breeder for a little bit. I grew up with Holsteins. I know there's behavioral differences between those cows. So some of those really more curious cows will probably sort a diet like that more aggressively, but I don't know if that means it's not necessarily ideal. So I wouldn't say it's more important for one breed than the other. And when you talk about age or parity, really high intake cows are when I'd be a little more concerned about these low forage rations, because that's so much fermentability going into the rumen and passing through so quickly. For a lower intake group of cows, I might be a little less concerned. So like if I was a dairyman or I was a nutritionist at a commercial dairy and I had a forage inventory issue, I would start with maybe trying to peel back my forage to my heifers a little bit and provide a little non-forage fiber to them, or maybe even consider some limit feeding strategies for those heifers. Then I'd go to my far off dry, then I'd go to my low cows, and then from there I would start balancing those priorities between your high cows, your fresh cows, and your close-up group. The last two I would touch would be your fresh cows and your close-up. You really want to keep those guts full. Otherwise, you probably have DAs running all over the place, and nobody wants that.
Do you think the effects that a low forage diet have on the rumen negatively impact lower gut permeability?
It's a great question. I don't think we know. I think it would be natural to expect that, especially if you're feeding something with really fermentable starch and really fermentable grains, but we don't have anything to say yes or no. The one thing I can tell you is there's a series of papers out of both the Netherlands and Iowa State where they looked at gut permeability with increasing the amount of starch that got to the hind gut. And in those cases, they did not observe an inflammatory response. They did see a dramatic change in fecal pH, but they had no like measurable blood stressor that changed. So that hind gut is one that I think the dairy science community is focusing on really intensely now, but we still just don't quite have our heads wrapped around it, especially in a mature cow, because it's almost impossible to get that sample as a scientist so we can analyze it. And it's one that I think we just need to understand more. We don't have the answers yet.
If someone wanted to put a low forage ration into place on their farm, do you have any recommendations for if like there are times of the year that would be better, where it would work better or more important when it comes to like feed quality or feed costs?
Sure. I mean, if you have the choice and you're like, oh, I'm going to consider this approach, I always like when you think about stresses and variation and all that, you want to do things when there's the least amount of stress already on that cow. So I think, I wouldn't do it in the peak of summer. I wouldn't do it during a cold snap in winter. I would try to do it when our weather's relatively stable, maybe spring or fall. And repeat the end of the question. I feel like there was another piece to that I might have just glossed over.
Just if there would be reasons to only use that type of ration for part of the year, like would it work better in a certain season or at a time of year when like feed quality might be better or worse?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's one season or the other that'd be more ideal. I just know that if I was introducing it as a new strategy or something where I knew I was going to have issues and I have to cut back on forage, you'd want to try not to do it, I think, in the peak of summer heat stress or in a cold snap where, those cows could use the gut fill and the fermentation to help keep them warm. I wish I had a better answer to that question.
No, that's good. And then similarly, someone's asking, are there certain regions of the country or different climates where you think a low forage diet is better suited than others?
I don't think so. I think, out west in the Southwest, the folks feeding cows in those regions have just gotten good at this because they have to do it because there is just less quality forage. I was at a meeting and there was a guy from New York and a guy from feeding from the West and Southwest, and he described his corn silages as trees compared to what they have in the Northeast, which is really digestible and really good, really, really good stuff. So that the folks in the West and Southwest have just gotten good at it. Not to say that climate is better, but they're just well practiced.
I have a question from someone who works with a lot of dairy producers in the South, Southwest. So said in their work in Western Texas and New Mexico, they found that letting forage add some maturity to increase yield and fiber through milk per ton, it goes down, is using UNDF 240 as a measure in the ration to keep steady with a higher forage diet and fill space with soy hulls.
Yeah, I think that approach intuitively makes a lot of sense, and that's given that they probably have a lot more experience than I do, I'd probably defer to their expertise. I would say I've always been a bit skeptical of using UNDF 240 as a number to hit in ration formulation, because when you think about how feed goes through a cow, it's going to be in the cow for about 30 hours. And so that UNDF 240 number, although it's a number we can have and it's shown to be useful in some cases, the number that's even more impactful on feed intake and milk yield is the 30 or 48 hour fiber digestibility. But again, in a 48 or in a low forage diet, all that traditional stuff I think kind of goes out the window and we need different metrics. So the approach they take I think certainly makes a lot of sense. It's similar to what I would take. I would probably be looking at doing the same thing but using that 30 or 48 hour number, where I would try to increase the amount of roughage in the undigestible roughage in there and fill in with the soy hulls as he kind of recommended, or she, sorry.
Good. One more question. How does BMR corn fit into this picture?
That's a really good question, and that's one I was thinking about prior to this webinar, and I think all of those go into what I just call the calculus of making a ration. And I think if you just look at it on a linear scale, if you have a BMR corn silage, you probably even need a little, in a low forage scenario, and you're feeding a BMR, you probably need a little bit less starch or a little less fermentation because of that digestible fiber. So all of that feeds into some of these ideal numbers. So if I think of that starch curve that I drew, where we want to find the optimum in the middle, if you have a BMR hybrid, that's probably going to shift the optimum to the left, and you need a little less starch in that case, or something like that. So that it's going to slide it on that scale, but I don't think very dramatically, maybe a point or two.
All right, thank you very much for answering those questions, and thank you to our audience members for participating with some really great questions. Once again, I want to thank our speaker, Dr. Kirby Krogstad from The Ohio State University. I also want to thank all our listeners for making the time to tune in to today's show. I hope you heard something that was useful to you and that you can put to use on your dairy or the dairies that you work with. As always, we're glad to have you in our audience. Until next time, goodbye from the team here at Hoard's Dairyman.